I don't consider myself even remotely feminist. I just believe in equal rights for men and women.
It's a really healthy response to acknowledging women's oppression. Acknowledging that it's real, that it's not imagined, and that it needs to be acted on, and actually creating a space to actually do that.
Everybody who is an activist in politics becomes involved because they want to change the world. Some people succeed and some people don't. I happen to be involved with a movement which gathered a lot of adherents along the way and did actually change things quite a great deal, I'm very proud to say.
But I made a commitment to myself before I allowed myself to go into parenting that I would work for peace and social justice, one way or another, to make the world a better place, not just for my children, but for children generally.
With the Aboriginal women, we tended to go out, have our family young, because it was very important. People like to be made a grandmother before they're 35, you know. And so it was very important then for Aboriginal women to go and have their family early, and then when the families start getting off their hands, then they can go and do their education. And this is the way that we've done it.
I think I've graduated from school with a very clear view that women could do anything, and what's more, with a sense of social responsibility saying that they should.
I was christened Cindy Lee, and even though I think that's a nice name and I always liked how it looked in writing and as a signature, I never really got called Cindy Lee. It was a really feminine name. For me it was more like a blonde sort of bimbo cheerleading, you know, sort of name almost, without, you know, disrespect to my mum. She wasn't to know that I was going to be what I became.
In year 11, I went to the National Capital Seminar in Canberra and I loved it, and then I decided that was what I wanted to do. I wanted to become a senator. So that was where it all started.
The enormous changes legally which have taken place over the last 100 years have been because of the waves, the two waves of feminism. The one at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, which got us the vote, which allowed us to sit on juries, which allowed us to enter professions and university, which allowed us to become politicians, which allowed us to do all the hundreds of things we're allowed to do today, to have custody of our children after divorce, to own property and so on. People have no idea how primitive women's lives were a mere 100 years ago.
Women were almost none. The whole of the legal and political setup was male. Women were an afterthought.
The fact that a married woman was not a legal entity in her own right, that a married woman was subsumed in her husband, and so she had no right to property or to signing legal contracts or anything like that.
I would be inclined to say that then men had great respect for women. At the same time, the respect, they nurtured women. They took pride in nurturing women. They took pride in being the breadwinner. But at the same time, they, in a way, looked down. They were the superior sex, which was quite evident.
One of the things that flowed from the new urban society, if you like, was the establishment of women's organisations. In 1892, the Women's Christian Temperance Union is established, and in 1894, the Karrakatta Club. Both of them organisations of women, middle-class, elite women, seeking to educate themselves and educate the society by enabling women to have a wider role in society. And these organisations agitated in a very gentlewomanly way for suffrage.
My mother, Olive Evans, and Aunt Bessie Rishworth were very close friends. They grew up with an aunt and uncle when they came from a farm in South Australia to school, and they remained with them until they grew up. He was the Treasurer of South Australia, so they had a very political atmosphere. They lived in an enormous house in Glenelg and entertained a lot. And I always thought how beautiful she was. And I used to sit and watch her getting dressed in the morning. It seemed to me to take hours, and the care she took with her makeup and doing her hair. And she always looked beautiful. The house was beautiful. she, how shall I put it? She kissed you formally.
The 1890s was a time of revolutionary transformation in Western Australia. Responsible government was established. Gold brought enormous prosperity to the colony, and there was a huge influx of migrants, mainly from the eastern colonies. The colony had been something of a backwater, and in the 1890s it boomed. Inspired by the success of New Zealand and South Australian women, West Australian women formed politically active organisations and lobbied resolutely for suffrage, the right to vote. Considered conservative and rather rural in their views, the Premier, Forrest, and his cabinet began the 1890s unsympathetic to women's suffrage.
Lord Forrest fought against it. Sir Walter James brought in a bill to give women the vote. About 3 times it was always, Forrest was really against it until Federation came along, and they did not want to join the Federation. So he gave the women the go to get more votes against it, because in the meantime gold had been discovered, and there were lots of people from the eastern states over here that wanted Federation, and Forrest wanted to defeat it. So that's how women got the vote.
So what we begin to see is a much greater attention to the needs of women and children, and a greater interest in social policy, a concern about women's employment, a concern about moral codes, all of which were the concern of these political citizen mothers. They wanted women to influence society, to make it more caring, to really clean up the mess that men had made. And so it's a sort of public housekeeping.
They were very concerned for the conditions of women prisoners, for example, for women in mental institutions. They worked hard to get clean milk, you know, to the community, and later to start up the King Edward Memorial Hospital and a district nursing service. And they were fearless.
While women were now effecting social infrastructures, very little changed in women's day-to-day lives. Household management and child-rearing continued to be women's responsibilities, if not in fact her principal purpose in life. In the 1930s, the threat of World War II instigated the first significant wave of non-Anglo migration to Western Australia. Predominantly British in outlook and relatively isolated, West Australians acclimatised slowly to the new cosmopolitan influences introduced by the new residents. While Europeans were escaping from the fall of the Iron Curtain, many Australians developed sympathies with socialist and Marxist principles. For many women, the communist cause for equal rights resonated with their own aspirations, and as a result, the women's movement experienced a reinvigoration in the late 1940s and into the 50s.
It was a fact of life in the West that if you got married you would have to resign or be sacked. They just did not employ married women, and that was it. So this problem didn't come up for a while, but it did when I was going steady with Pete Thomas, another reporter. And I had to look at the question, and I didn't like the look of it very much at all. But, well, love triumphed in the end, of course, and I resigned rather than be sacked. So that was it was an experience that committed me to the women's movement for equality. I had always wanted women to be equal.
Women's liberation, when it arrives in the late 1960s, doesn't arrive into an empty space.
Women were so terribly eager to learn more about their condition and why they were oppressed.
You could feel the change. You could feel the change coming.
I married young. I'd had 2 children by the time I was 23, and found myself at 24 wondering what on earth I was going to do the rest of my life.
what were they going to do for the next 20 years?
I went back to uni. I did law. I was the first and only married woman with children in the class.
I became a little more rebellious, I suppose, to the conventional means of expressing activism, and I got involved in the women's movement and the anti-Vietnam War and in student politics as well.
The first thing that caused me to become involved was the fact that I worked in a couple of women's refuges in the 1970s, and what I saw there told me straight away that things needed to be changed.
We were supporting abortion on demand, you know, we were supporting things, childcare, you know, children being ripped away from their mothers, and I don't know, this was a communist plot. It was all a communist plot. At the time my first of my 5 children started kindergarten, my husband, who was a general practitioner in Midland, said to me, "I want you to get involved in community activities." And the reason he said this to me because he was seeing so many middle-aged women amongst his practice who were becoming alcoholics. Empty nest syndrome we used to talk about. And so it was to save me from becoming an alcoholic that I eventually became a senator.
I did my university entrance at night school while I was working, and then I got accepted into the first school of nursing that they had on the campus here at Waite, it was then. That was the first nursing school in Australia. And so, and from there, I just went ahead and leaps and bounds, because I thought to myself, I will be judged on my qualifications and my merit and how I did my work, not on the prejudice that were running rife in hospitals, because Aboriginal women weren't actually accepted to be looking after sick white people, I guess you might say like that.
So one of the very, very important things that happened for women during those early 70 years were the opportunity for second chance education. Not all of them were able to take it up, but a few were, and as a few did it, a few more did it. And so there were mature women doing part-time study, not necessarily only in the universities, but in the technical institutions, and later going back and even going back to secondary education and completing that, opening up doors which they will insist are available for their daughters. There'll be no closing those doors.
Personal is political. And so whole issues about sexuality, about women's entitlement to fulfil their sexuality, about gender divisions of labour, relations with husbands, lovers, sons, daughters, family relations, all were up for negotiation, all were up for change.
Yes, well, I felt that the gesture of throwing away the bra was a symbol of throwing away your femininity. They were going to get where they wanted to get as men by using men's methods, whereas in that earlier phase of feminism, they expected to be accepted as persons of equal value with all their femininity intact. They didn't have to it's quite a different mental outlook.
The one that caused the upheaval was the attempt to show for women to be able to examine their own genitalia. There was a small medical illustration of a woman's vagina. This was terrible stuff. You can show women nude as you like in all the glossy magazines, but this was the last straw. So I think there was a fine for the university paper, but it had a very wide circulation, I can tell you that.
The coming out of the closet and the coming into the public arena, issues that had hitherto been treated as secret and private, so that domestic violence, incest, sexual abuse within marriage, all of those things suddenly became topics that people could talk about and condemn and start to take action and move against.
you'll hear people lament about the loss of society, and people lament about crime and all this sort of stuff, but they don't seem to actually reconcile their own individualistic attitudes with that same loss of the way that perhaps people would like things to be. And that always baffles me a bit. I don't know why people can't see the connections, because they seem very clear to me. But,
Like a lot of people will come up and say, wow, that's really great, or I never thought of that before, or thanks, that was great. And then I've had lots of people walk up and look at me and just sort of, you know, turn their heads away and just not even want to look at me, as if, how dare you talk about the fact that gay people in WA don't have any equality rights, you know, that other states have, or how dare you talk about the way we're treating the environment, or how dare you say anything that confronts me.
I don't think feminism had any impact on the Aboriginal women in the 60s and 70s, because the Aboriginal women were so busy struggling with life, with the prejudices of the society, with trying to keep their kids out of hospital, and all these things that were happening, and dealing with husbands who, at that particular time, because all the physical type jobs were just absolutely closing down because of the mechanism of the society, that the men actually were then feeling the impact of not being able to work. And so there was all these things were tumbling in. And apart from that fact is that because of the rules that came out in with the unions in the pastoralist area, it pushed a lot of people off the land and into the cities, and so there was a big swing of people into the cities, and everybody was actually struggling to get housing. A lot of the people were living on verandas or in camps, and I think feminism was something that was just for the idle rich.
We really have to make sure that women's voices are heard at all levels in the community. So the parliamentary representation is just one bit of the process. What happens in community groups and in all levels of the workplace and decision making is so important, and that's where we've really got to do a lot more encouraging of women to make sure their voices are heard.
There are very high-profile lobbyists. There are people who become famous, like Germaine Greer, and there were foot soldiers like myself, who were just one of dozens and dozens of people who put submissions to parliamentarians, who did petitions, who made speeches, who put out press releases, who organised meetings, who just did hundreds and hundreds of things on a daily basis, if you like, to try and change things. And we succeeded in changing laws. We made things different for women in all sorts of ways.
Women's issues became a principal social concern during the 60s and 70s. Organisations like the Women's Electoral Lobby impressed upon political parties the potential for appealing to women voters by including more women in the parliamentary process.
I have this terrible dilemma about women in politics. I want more women to be in politics because I want, for a start, the Parliament of Western Australia and every other parliament in the world to resemble real life. In real life, 50% of the population are women, about. And in Parliament, that's not true. And in Parliament, there are people who represent more extreme religious views than you regularly find in the community, for example. So I want Parliament to be more like real life, therefore I want more women. But the truth of the matter is that it is a terribly, terribly hard job. And it would be immensely difficult to do with young children, although some women do it.
I think more people would become more interested and more involved in politics. For starters, if they liked what they saw. I think a lot of people see politicians who are being dishonest or aren't keeping their mandate, so to speak, and so they don't like that, so they don't really want to have a lot to do with it. Like a lot of people see me that I want to be a politician and say, oh no, why would you want to be a politician? Because they don't see it as something that's good, they see it really as a cutthroat sort of industry.
I think that working in the Parliament is one of the most adversarial workplaces you can imagine. Perhaps the legal profession is the only one that would be more so. But a lot of women don't like that style of spending their time. You know, perhaps all parliamentarians need a series of instructive sessions on conflict resolution, for example, so that we can get into win-win situations rather than winners and losers. a lot of women I know just don't want to waste a lot of their time on being adversarial when it's not really necessary.
It actually takes a huge personal toll on people. And I would have had enormous troubles trying to negotiate childcare for a 2.5-year-old because the process is designed for middle-class men in suits with families and women that can stay behind and run their lives for them. And if you are a young woman with a sole parent with a young child, it's not exactly conducive to that.
I think that we have to make sure that there is decent childcare provided, for one thing. I mean, that new Parliament House was designed without childcare. I mean, that's pretty outrageous.
The view of some in the community that women shouldn't be anywhere but in the home, that's still surprisingly common, not as an expressed attitude, but as a, if you like, a sentiment that underpins some of the actions that people take. I remember when I was Premier occasionally confronting, quite senior members of the community who you could clearly see thought that a woman shouldn't be in this job. There was a sort of eye-rolling response that said, what the hell are you doing here?
Well, I think that one of the things that was different about me is that I wasn't prepared to use the same kind of language that other people used. So I did talk about love being a most important starting point for our discussions about the future. And I think people thought that was a bit odd. But I was just being me. On the other hand, there were many times when they shut me up. They actually closed the Senate down on 3 occasions because I was speaking. And there's a way that you can do that. If the whips of both the major parties agree, they have to collude to tell their senators when the bell rings, because there isn't a quorum, they would say, don't come in, it's Valentine talking, we want to shut her up. So they actually closed the Senate down, which is pretty appalling. But, that's the way it went. So there were some wins, I suppose, and some losses because I was on my own, because I was a woman, or because I was saying things that they really didn't want to get onto the public agenda. And I think that it was a combination of all of those things that made life difficult, but also very interesting, and sometimes very amusing.
I like the fact that I can sleep at night and think, well, I'm doing what I can. And sometimes I despair and think, oh shit, there's so much I want to do, And if I could single-handedly save the old growth forests, and if I could single-handedly stop uranium mining and single-handedly stop, racism and oppression of women, and if I could do all of that, I would love it. But I can't, and I'm one person, and I do what I can.
I have this segment of my show. It's one of my favourite bits, actually, and usually ends up being the audience's favourite bit of the show. It's a verbal rap with no music, and it's focusing on basically individual being what the individual wants to be, to do in life what they want to do. It'll consume like a sweet perfume, unlike a noxious toxic fume, through your nose and into each ear, eliminating every single fear. You find that you got everything that you need, indeed, to succeed, create a new breed. Don't hesitate to linger on negativity, just engage in hardcore activity. 1, 2, 3, 4. All you have to do is to believe a boring state you can't leave. Chase something you want to receive, believe, receive, achieve. You know you want it. Want now, stretch out those hands, grab it somehow. You know you want it. Want now, stretch out those hands, grab it somehow.
I think you get, in a way, you get more of an equal interaction now, because some of the young women I meet are absolutely amazing how extremely well educated and well trained they are. The things they do are mighty, that's all I can say.
There has been a lot done before we got here. We've grown up in a generation where it's not a problem, really. I don't think it's all going to be thrown away or that we don't care per such. I think it's more just that we're not going to stand for it, and that's all there is to it. We're just not going to put up with it. I mean, I know so many girls who are saying, I'm going to be the first female Prime Minister of Australia.
Women are increasingly moving into areas which have been traditionally male occupations, but for the moment, these women remain the exception. Western Australia is unique in its economic structures. It's a third of the continent with a small city. The emphasis is on development enterprises, construction, mining, pastoralism and farming, which are considered traditional areas of men's work. Larger cities have allowed for a greater diversity in industries and a more cosmopolitan society. But Western Australia has a small population, and this perhaps has preserved the conventional male strongholds.
equal pay had been on the agenda for a long time, but actually analysing what we meant by equal pay. And we still haven't got equal jobs, 27 years later. There is technically equal pay for equal work, but women still, as a class, don't have access to the better paid jobs, which make sure that men have an average weekly earnings considerably higher than women's.
Because the status quo seems to be so much in the men's court, if you like, in this state, that it's a state with a lot of industrial development in the northwest and station properties and big landscapes, which are quite harsh environments for women to survive in. So that when women do come to the fore, they're really challenging a whole lot about the status quo in this state, and that's pretty serious sort of a challenge.
Over the last 100 years, the changes have been enormous. We actually have status in law now which is the equal of men's, and that's the first time in many, many centuries. So the changes have been huge. Don't let's ever minimise them. The changes which have to take place now are the changes in people's hearts and minds.
Well, there has been a lot of improvements over the last couple of decades, but there is certainly a long way to go. And although we got the vote in 1967, you cannot legislate to make people change their way of thinking and being and doing.
Even if the law says that men and women are equal, as I say, if those broader structural elements in the community are still prohibitive of that equality, then it's unlikely to occur. And some of those things are also embedded in associated attitudes, and they don't occur by accident. It's because they're being supported by a point of view. So if not enough money is going into childcare and obstacles are being placed in the way of women to participate in the workforce by that means, it's not only because childcare is not sufficiently well funded, it's because there are people in senior levels of the society, including government, who either don't care that they do participate or are actively resisting their participation.
When I'm travelling overseas, first time I ever went overseas, I was so enlightened by the whole experience, because all of a sudden I was released from this terrible bondage that I knew nothing about while I was in this country. And from that minute I wanted to come home and get every Aboriginal person I knew to get out there and get overseas and get the feeling of what this... you don't understand what oppression is until you leave this country and you go overseas and you get treated as an equal. And it is very powerful. So once that's happened to you, they can't put the oppression stuff back on you, because you just won't handle it, you say that.
1, 2, 3, 4. All you have to do is to believe a boring state you can't leave. Chase something you want to receive, believe, receive, achieve. You know you want it. Want now, stretch out those hands, grab it somehow. You know you want it. Want now, stretch out those hands, grab it somehow. All you have to do is to believe a boring state you can't leave. Chase something you want to receive, believe, receive, achieve. You know you want it. Want now, stretch out those hands, grab it somehow. You know you want it. Want now, stretch out those hands, grab it somehow. So, I mean, that sort of song, something like that, it's very, definitely encouraging people to be what they want to be. You've got one life, you've got to live it to the full.